On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the ASEAN-China Foreign Ministers Meeting has made progress in resolving the South China Sea dispute.
COC 的磋商将会加速向前推进。
Can cooperation in China's backyard lead to diplomatic success further afield? And China has set its own economic policy. Can China weather the economic storm coming from abroad? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We start in Singapore, where Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi is attending the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meeting. The meeting has ended on a high note, with both sides arriving at a single draft negotiation context of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Minister Wang also met with other counterparts from the U.S., the EU, the DPRK, and Iran. Before we go to our panelists, take a look at this first.
A milestone of China-ASEAN ties. On the 10+1 ministerial meeting in Singapore, ASEAN countries and China agreed to a draft code of conduct regarding the disputes in the South China Sea.
The ASEAN member states and China have arrived at a single draft COC negotiating text. This will be a living document, and it will be the basis for future COC negotiations. We have also agreed on the key modalities for the future rounds of the COC negotiations.
2018 marks the 15th anniversary of the ASEAN-China Strategic Partnership. The two sides will adopt ASEAN-China Strategic Partnership Vision 2030 at the ASEAN-China Summit in Singapore in November. They also agreed to hold a joint maritime exercise in October, which will enhance confidence and trust among the ASEAN and Chinese navies.
We believe that without any disturbances from the outside, Code of Conduct consultations will accelerate. Our cooperation on security affairs will be elevated.
On the sidelines of the ministerial meetings, Wang Yi also met with his U.S. counterpart, Mike Pompeo. China and the United States are in the midst of an increasingly bitter trade war. U.S. President Trump said he's considering raising the tariffs of the $200 billion worth of Chinese goods to 25% instead of the 10% proposed earlier.
We are willing to resolve the concerns of both sides via talks on the basis of unequal voting and mutual respect. Mr. Pompeo was accommodating on this as a direction, and said that he does not want current frictions to continue.
China is a strong defender of free trade and multilateralism. This has also been the foundation of the Southeast Asian Bloc's integration. Cooperation between China and ASEAN would be closer once maritime disputes are addressed.
And for more on the China-ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meeting, we are here joined in Beijing, Song Qingren, who is the unit chief of the Bay of Bengal Rim Unit with the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. That's quite a long title, I have to say. Well, complicated situation there in Southeast Asia. Also, we have in Singapore, Lin Ten-Wai, Adjunct Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore. Welcome, sir. In Boston, U.S., we are joined by Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. Welcome, sir. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Song, very briefly, if you can, how do you see the achievements made by Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi this time? It seems there's a long list of achievements with the ASEAN countries.
Yeah, the first, I think we mainly focus on the COC, the draft of the COC, and now based on this draft, we are very directly to touch upon the negotiation of the details of the COC, and also I think it's not so far for us to see the final draft of the COC in the near future. Now, second, I think China-ASEAN have a consensus about the future vision about in 2030. So the next 50 years about. So we have the consists to build a very bright future for our bilateral relations.
Okay, a lot of good news, it seems, according to you. To you, Mr. Lim, what about that? The COC, just to explain to our viewers who do not necessarily that familiar with the term, that is a code of conduct in the South China Sea. We all know there are some territorial disputes, there are issues that needs to be worked out, and therefore countries between ASEAN and China have to come up with a draft to talk about the code of conduct. That's what we're talking about. Mr. Lim, this is so-called the final negotiating draft text. So to what extent will that pave the way for an eventual document? Do you see a timeline?
The single draft of the COC is a very important document. Before the single draft was available, there were many different drafts on the Code of Conduct. This single draft consolidates all the points in the different drafts into a single document. That's why it's seen as a milestone in the negotiations between ASEAN and China over the South China Sea. The COC single draft will become the foundation from which future negotiations will take place. Of course, there will be more negotiations that will be needed.
Yeah.
It's going to be a complex process, but the single draft is the single most important thing in order for them to have a platform in which to jumpstart the negotiations. Now, there are also other more concrete measures that have been laid out as well. For example, the ASEAN countries and China have tested the hotlines between them, and the emergency hotlines between them over the related to the South China Sea. And so these are concrete things that contribute to the single draft.
Right.
So eventually, I think all stakeholders will come together and refer to this document for further negotiations.
Eventually, we don't know when, it sounds like still, but Mr. Song, the Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang Yi also said, if without outside interference, the process can be sped up. That's a direct quote coming from Foreign Minister Wang. To what extent can that be sped up? And under the current geopolitical situation, is it a possibility?
Yeah, we hope so. This is the best way for bilateral, justify bilateral negotiation. But now we can see that the situation is complicated because the U.S., Japan, even Australia, or even India, they want to involved in the South China issue to some extent, to a different extent. So this outside interference is an obstacle for China-ASEAN to reach the final and official version of the COC very quickly.
Will that be an obstacle, Mr. Lim?
I think those are two separate issues, because the single draft for the COC will now have to be between ASEAN and China.
Right.
As for the other issues, including the freedom of navigation operations, that will depend on other factors and other negotiations.
We will have our American guests to comment later when we move further into the conversation. Let me ask you a little bit more about the China and ASEAN countries. Besides the draft of the COC, we also see the two sides have agreed to have joint military exercise in October. Meanwhile, there's going to be the leaders' meeting, which is called 10+1, meaning ASEAN countries plus China, in the month of November. So there seems to be a whole series of interactions that could happen at different levels on different fields. Mr. Lim, what does that mean? How is that compared to China-ASEAN relations, let's just say last year or the year before last? Are we seeing hope of improving ties?
First of all, the exercises between ASEAN and China is very important. In fact, there are two sets of exercises. The first set will be taking place in early August. This is called the Tabletop Maritime Naval Exercise.
It is going on right now.
So this is between ASEAN and ASEAN countries and China. And the second one would be in the October, and that will be at the field itself. So this is very important because this is a single most important confidence building measure between ASEAN navies and the Chinese Navy. It will help to build confidence and familiarity between the navies of the countries involved and help them to know each other at a personnel level, equipment level, and also be able to work out confidence building in terms of avoiding tensions and avoiding conflicts or accidents.
On that, I want to involve Mr. Walsh, Jim Walsh, coming from Boston. Mr. Walsh, we see Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang Yi met Pompeo. The two discussed. We got some quotes coming from their joint, from their different statements after the meeting. Chinese Foreign Minister said China would like to talk to the United States based on the equal footing and mutual respect. Of course, he's talking about a lot of issues, I guess. Mr. Walsh, how do you see China and the United States in this region? Trade, geopolitics, military, regional issues with neighboring countries.
All right. First, let me say, I disagree with you and my colleagues, esteemed colleagues. I think there's a bit of overselling going on with respect to the ASEAN announcements today. I mean, they're positive, they're good, but they're baby steps. We may look back 20 years from now and think they're important, but there is no text. There's a misleading language here that suggests that we have a text. We really don't have a negotiated text. The negotiations begin now, and within ASEAN, we talk about ASEAN as if it's one country when it's 10 very different countries. Vietnam has a very different point of view than Cambodia. And while it's great to see these confidence-building measures, I'm totally in favor of confidence-building measures. There are military exercises only insofar as they involve the navies. They're really about sort of rescue and search and incidents at sea. They're not military exercises as we would traditionally call them. Again, all good, but I think there's some exaggeration going on here. This is the very tip, the very beginning of a process. It's not the middle, and it's certainly not the end. Now, as far as the U.S.-China relationship goes, you know,
let me just, when you said that, Mr. Walsh, let me have the Chinese colleague to respond to what you have just said, because it seems that you are having very different concepts here. Mr. Song, very briefly from you.
Yeah, I think China now the ASEAN countries are worried about the China and the U.S. and China competition in this region. So they want China, U.S. have how to say good competition, not confrontation. Right. So they want to keep good relations with both China and the U.S. Not to want to see trade wars or trade conflicts or other kind of geopolitical confrontation.
Right. Yeah. But Mr. Song, what about the draft that Mr. Walsh was talking about? He doesn't believe it's a real draft, and you said it is. And it's significant. What do you say?
I think we should be patient and to see the achievements to step by step, because these talks this negotiation of COC has been for several years. Right. So this text is a milestone or very important step for China-ASEAN to reach the final and official version of COC. Yeah.
Mr. Walsh, Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said today during his meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister, and also afterwards, he talked about United States as a Pacific power, and he talked about the United States is going to emphasize a lot on the relations with the ASEAN countries, so-called centrality in a way. Meanwhile, it is no secret the U.S. is working on the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, whether it's military budget or when it comes to trade and military relations. So, Mr. Walsh, what is the desire of the United States in the region? Is it really to counter the influence that China has had, or the interactions China has had with many of those in the region? It sounds like.
Well, I think certainly there are elements in the U.S. government who have that view, that they see a rising China and they want to counter it. I think other people in the U.S. government have a different point of view, that it's about maintaining peace and stability, international waterways, and managing the political relations. I think when it comes to U.S. strategy in the Pacific, ASEAN, is important. Pompeo made an announcement about a small amount of money it plans to invest. But at the end of the day, the sort of top tier when it comes to U.S. strategy in the Pacific really focuses on its treaty partners: Japan, South Korea, Australia, the traditional allies that it has had for a decade. So that's really where most of the attention, most of the focus is ASEAN is important to the U.S., but I think the other countries I named are more important to the U.S.
Well, Mr. Lim, of course, within ASEAN countries, there are different people looking at the issue between China and the United States differently, but the biggest fear, as far as I understand, is being caught in between these two powers. And the trade war is not going to be an easy thing for any of these countries in the ASEAN region. Mr. Lim, at this point, what is the best way for ASEAN to maintain a balance and therefore not to add fire to any side or to bet on any side? Mr. Lim.
ASEAN has been maintaining strong relations with traditional partners like US, Japan, and the EU. Since the foundation of ASEAN, they have been working with Japan, US, and EU very closely. At the same time, ASEAN is also outreaching to emerging powers like China and India, especially with China in the Belt and Road Initiative, and also with India in several initiatives. And so ASEAN is trying to outreach to everyone, and therefore it is known as the ASEAN centrality.
Right.
Prime Minister Modi, in his recent speech in Shangri-La Dialogue, has also mentioned ASEAN's centrality. And in that sense, ASEAN is trying to maintain peace, prosperity by working with all the parties concerned, traditional partners and also emerging powers, and also other middle powers in the region.
That just sounds beautiful,
so,
but
that is,
as you may know, the Singaporean
way.
Prime Minister, during his public speech at the ASEAN meeting, has already talked about the fear among ASEAN countries to be caught in between the United States and China. And today, the news just came out that after the United States have threatened move from 10% to 25% tariffs on $200 billion US goods coming from China, China has also decided to slash tariffs on 60 billion US of goods coming to China. So you see, when you start war of trade, none could be the winner, and yet once it started, it's very hard to come to an end of all the so-called economic warfare. Having said that, though, Mr. Walsh, we understand Pompeo prepared to talk about Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and a vision for, he called, a open, transparent, rules-based region after the U.S. pronounced a plan to spend more than $100 million. That's about $1.13 million in a way to infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region. The money is only a small slice, according to the numbers we see from other countries investing in the region. But it seems that the U.S. just want to have a role that the others are also having, even though that is a role the U.S. ignored earlier as the U.S. withdrew from the TPP, and also the U.S. do not necessarily work that much with the region. Mr. Walsh.
Yes, well, I agree that the $113 million is a small drop in the bucket, but it's not for development projects like you might have from a bank. It's basically a small amount of money to try to leverage private money and to improve what is really more technical infrastructure so that the ASEAN countries can bring greater private investment. But I agree, it's a small amount of money. I would say, to go back to your earlier question, you know, what can ASEAN do? I don't think it can do very much. It's a bunch of smaller countries that are caught in the middle. You know, obviously, if they have any influence, they would try to get the U.S. and China not to have a trade war, but they don't have the influence. They're sort of victims in all this. If this
I'm not sure whether the ASEAN countries has the influence.
I hope it doesn't go.
Nor does the other countries around the world, but rather President Trump, he has the influence. That's the thing that he does not want to do.
Yes, I agree.
He wants to start a trade war. He wants to continue that trade war, make everybody a loser. That's what he wants to do. Having said that, though, let's talk about China and ASEAN countries even further. China and ASEAN countries remain active interactions. And Malaysia, for example, is one of the key players in the region. 93-year-old Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad won unexpected election victory in May, and earlier last month he said he will visit Beijing in August to renegotiate terms for China-backed rail and gas pipeline projects in Malaysia worth more than $22 billion US. Mr. Song, I want to tap into your expertise. Of course, Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang already met with Mr. Mohammed. And the thing is, what's going to happen during Mr. Mahathir Mohamad's visit in August? That is a very interesting issue. How will the two sides come to an agreement about the next stage of blueprint?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, just we see the news that Mahathir met Mr. Wang Yi. He said that Mahathir said that China-Malaysia relations are still friendly, and he is looking forward to visit China in soon. And also he will talk about with China official leaders about some big projects. Second, I think we don't worry so much about this big projects, the destiny. I think there will be some adjustment, new bargaining and new negotiations, and new adjustment of big projects. But I don't think all of the big projects between China and Malaysia will be cancelled. This is my point.
I see. And Mr. Lim, you have some views also, even though you're coming from Singapore. I'm sure you've been observing that issue for quite some time. Briefly.
There are three important points here. Prime Minister Mahathir mentioned that he will review the projects. So the outcome of the projects is still unknown, and this is probably dependent on the second point, which is the outcome of his visit to Beijing. And this requires a lot of analysis. But the third point, which is less often mentioned, is that he has appointed Mr. Robert Kwok to be an advisor on China. Mr. Kwok is, of course, very familiar with China. He's a billionaire based, a Malaysian billionaire based in Hong Kong. And so he's going to be some kind of contact or bridge between Malaysia and China. So we need to sort of see the configuration of all these factors, particularly the upcoming meeting between Prime Minister Mahathir and the Chinese leadership, to know the direction in which the review of the project is going.
Of course, when that happens, we're going to bring to our audience worldwide. Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. Song Qingrun, Lin Tianwei, and Jim Walsh. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program. China's leadership convened to set China's economic policy. Can China maintain economic growth despite uncertainty from abroad? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Tuesday's meeting of the Political Bureau meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China set the direction of economic work for the rest of the 2018. China's top policymakers say they will continue its active fiscal and prudent monetary policies through the second half of the year. Before we ask our panelists about what is likely to be the impact on China's economy and whether China is going to weather the storm globally, let's take a look at this.
Amid complex economic changes in and outside China, the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China convened. The meeting was chaired by General Secretary Xi Jinping. Those at the meeting said China has carried on opening up and the economy saw steady growth in the first half of the year. They agreed that the focus in the second half of the year will be preventing and resolving major risks, eliminating poverty, and alleviating pollution. They also said China will accelerate construction of a modern economic system and promote high-quality development. 6 major tasks were addressed to tackle internal and external challenges. First, the country will continue to achieve fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy to better control the monetary supply and keeping liquidity at a reasonable level. Second, deepening supply-side structural reforms continues to be a focus. To cultivate new growth drivers, intensified efforts will be made in improving infrastructure and innovation capability. Third, the meeting said it will work to diffuse any financial risk to better help the development of their real economy. Fourth, the meeting reiterated the importance of deepening the reform and opening up policy and advancing the Belt and Road Initiative. Fifth, the leadership called for a continuous firm curb of home prices and the establishment of a long-term mechanism to ensure the stability and healthy development of the property market. Finally, the meeting pledged to effectively improve people's lives and ensure social stability by adding more jobs, increasing people's salaries, and improving education and social security.
More about China's policy for the latter half of this year. With us here in Beijing, SITAO, who is the chief economist from DELOITTE China. In Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, managing director, head of research from BOCOM International, and also in St. Louis, United States, Steve PRUITT, managing partner at the WAS Partners. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. I want to begin by asking you, how should we interpret some of the specific quotes coming from the policy lines of the last meeting? According to the statement released after the meeting of the Politburo, as the external environment has changed notably, the stability of employment, financial sector, foreign trade, foreign and domestic investments must be maintained. Now, SITAO, help us to understand what kind of external environment do you think it is referring to, and is that the viable solution, what has been mentioned earlier?
External environment is really about the trade spat between China and the United States, which is really evolving and at quite a fast pace. It seems to me in the short term there will be some tit for tat, and which would result in disruptions for both economy and financial market. Therefore, policymakers would like to put economic growth on a much higher priority item than other goals.
I see. Mr. PRUITT, when it comes to U.S.-China trade, of course, today there's more a tit for tat going on with the U.S., $200 billion from 10 to 25% on China's tariffs, and China also working on the U.S. Import to China, $60 billion. Likely to be slashed with the further tariffs. So having said that, though, where is it driving us? What is the biggest challenge for the U.S. economy, and what do you consider the biggest challenge for the Chinese economy as a result?
Well, in America, I think our biggest challenge is clearly going to be weathering the storm. The tariffs that the Chinese have proposed are very targeted, and strategically, you know, if one wants to judge them in terms of who's winning and who's impacting, they are very specifically targeted at sectors and products that are going to have a fairly immediate impact on the American citizenry and then in turn on our politicians. In terms of how all of this plays out in China, I think clearly the meeting this week suggests that the Chinese are maybe wisely starting to figure out that this is not going to be a simple turn of events with President Trump, where on Tuesday he makes one statement and by Friday we're in another page. He at least so far is showing a great level of consistency and push on this initiative. So they're digging in and getting ready, and rightfully so.
Mr. Hong, it is no secret that the societies in the United States and China are both concerned about what might be the outcome of this trade war, even just the rhetorics to begin with. Do you see that some of the policies being proposed during the meeting are going to help China to weather this storm? Is it mainly the problems from outside or China's own economy?
Well, I think, you know, we're facing external challenges as well as this domestic slowdown. And obviously this year, because of the shrinking of the shadow banking industry, credit growth has been decelerating rather fast. So, you know, as a result, you know, into the second half of the year, we're probably going to see a slower growth environment domestically. I think externally, because of the trade war, that's going to affect Chinese exports as well. But, you know, external demand really is not entirely up to the Chinese government to control, and I think that is why we're probably facing quite a bit of challenge in the second half of this year.
And that is why, according to that meeting, the government will deepen, quote, its structural supply side reforms and firmly continue to deleveraging to better combine the tasks of forestalling and diffusing financial risks with serving the real economy. But SITAO, I mean, that has been said for quite some time. Are we seeing result of improvement? Is this time going to be different?
We have seen improvement. The leverage ratio has stopped rising in past few months. That's a huge achievement, but also at a cost. The cost is really about what Mr. Hong has alluded earlier, the reduction of shadow banking activities and result in domestic slowdown. So the issue is right now we are facing the trade-off between short-term pain and long-term gain. So that's not an easy trade-off. Again, the priority seems to be on economic growth. On
economic growth, but the debt problem is a big one. We also understand not only at the the local level, provincial level, but much lower level, and also enterprises as well. So these are gigantic tasks for China to handle with. Not to mention now there's a trade war going on that makes a lot of things unpredictable. Mr. Hong, can some of the things being mentioned in the document really become this magical way of doing things?
Probably you're not going to see obvious effect in the near term. Obviously, structural reform, especially supply side reform, has been ongoing for 2 years now. We're seeing some results in upstream industries, and I think this year, much of the earnings growth is coming from the upstream industry, and also, we're seeing some price effect on commodities as well. But I think, into the downstream industries, we're still not seeing sort of the effect coming from the upstream industries. So I think, to complete the structural reform, it probably take a couple of more years. So that is why I think in the near term, probably we have to be a little bit patient to wait for the results.
One of the biggest things, Mr. Xu, is to let people feel confident and they want to spend, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing that China really needs. But now with the trade war and also the banking changes of the policies, as well as some of the other unpredictabilities in the financial sector, a lot of people tend to want to wait and watch. Mr. Xu, will that continue for quite some time?
I'm still hopeful this so-called trade war will turn out to be just some sort of skirmish between United States and China. And this trade war can be used by policymakers to be used as external pressure for opening up domestic economy. So that will turn the situation around. I also think the policymakers do have some policy leeway because despite jitters in financial market, I think the risk of systematic risk remains low.
What about the interactions, not only of trade but also investment between China and the United States, Mr. PRUITT? I mean, with the current thing going on, and you see China's overall policy for the latter half of this year, according to this document, what are the messages you are getting?
Well, a couple of things are clearly happening that I think most Americans are not aware of. For example, China's importation of energy has continued to click ahead at a very good pace. The fact that they are rebalancing and doing leveraging as part of their ongoing program, I doubt that Americans will see much of an impact from that. But again, as China improves, quite frankly, it actually does benefit America in many ways. So Americans are going to be focusing, I think, very intensely on their own pockets, which is why this trade war and the sanctions going back and forth across the ocean, at the end of the day, don't really benefit Americans as much as they might think.
Well, it is also in this document that the authorities showed firm resolve in regulating the property market. The CPC meeting said the rise in home prices should be firmly curbed and that the establishment of a long-term mechanism should be accelerated. Now, Mr. Hong, the real estate issue is always a big one. At times, when the economy is getting better, the external environment is relatively calm. China always wanted to make sure the real estate is not going to be the pillar of its economy. But it seems that things have changed again. So will the real estate sector be once again re-streamlined, or it is going to, just as yesterday, once more?
I hope not. I think the property market bubble is rather large as it is. So if you pump more money into the sector, probably gonna push the bubble and property price further away from our objective. So I think at the moment the policy objective really is to contain the property bubble. But I think going into the second half of the year, there's another area of the economy that we can use to boost up growth, which is the infrastructure spending. In the first half of this year, we're seeing infrastructure spending year-on-year growth is actually decelerated to negative growth. So I think we haven't seen such low spending growth for years and years. So I think this is the first time in recent years it's been negative. So I think in the second half of the year, instead of relying on the property market, we can rely on infrastructure spending to boost up growth.
Can that be done, Mr. Xu? I mean, the real estate market is usually this magical button, isn't it? That once the growth rate is down, it could be pushed, and therefore the number could be up a little bit. We all know that. But this time it's going to be very different and difficult circumstances compared to maybe some years ago. So will this real change likely to happen?
Well, I think it has been widely recognized. There are certain valuation issues, so valuation of property prices in certain cities out of whack. I think that's being widely recognized. But at the same time, I think there's still a lot of demand, particularly for the young. So I think the policies should be designed in such a way actually to help those who really have genuine demand. At the same time, and with jitters in financial market, I suspect some of the developers may experience financial distress. That's why I think this document has highlighted the importance of preventing financial risk.
After all, preventing financial risk is one of the most important 3 tasks China has set for itself in the next 3 years. Having said that, though, according to the statement, fiscal policy should play a bigger role in structural adjustment. The country will continue to implement a proactive fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy. Of course, these are terminologies that the Chinese use a lot over the years. Mr. Pruitt, to the United States, what that means is what about the exchange rate? What that means is how about the role of the Chinese government in the financial sector? On those issues, your input here.
Well, I think the U.S. Financial system is still rebounding from our crash of 2009. So they're going to be watching the developments in China as you continue to manipulate, as we like to say in America, or manage, more appropriately, your currency value. I think one other thing that you mentioned a few minutes ago about infrastructure should, not only in terms of benefiting China, should serve as a good opportunity for China to do some outreach to some of the major companies in the construction field here in the United States, either to come in as partners or to actually come in and do some of that work. That would provide additional openings and I think bring additional pressure on the discussions around trade and trade sanctions, because obviously those are real dollars that are being spent on real projects.
Right, but Mr. Hong, is Mr. Pruitt have wishful thinking here, given the quite complicated geopolitical environment here?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, we're seeing some investment restrictions already for Chinese investments to go to the U.S. And also, domestically, the statement says that, we're going to use proactive fiscal policy while maintaining a sort of a prudent monetary policy. Now, the thing is that, once your fiscal goes into expansion mode, it's a little bit difficult to, keep your monetary policy neutral, because, the fiscal spending is going to drive up monetary supply, and then it's going to flow through the system. So, there's a delicate balance here.
It is a delicate balance. And Mr. Xu, final words from you about that.
I think the balance is about using fiscal levers as counter-cyclical measure, but at the same time trying to avoid certain policy errors of 2008.
All right. SITAO, Hong Hao, and Steve PRUITT. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Have a great weekend. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.